Welcome back. I'm Pemberton, and this is Book 6, Part 4, The Close of the Book, and the End of King Saul. Twice in these chapters David catches his hunter helpless, once in the dark of a cave, once asleep in the middle of his own camp, and twice, though his men beg him to strike, David will not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed, but takes a token and lets the king go. It shames Saul, but it does not save him. We will sit with the strange, haunted story of Saul's last night, when, with Samuel dead and God silent, the king who once banished the necromancers creeps in disguise to consult the witch of Endor and meets a word of doom. And then the last battle on Mount Gilboa, where Jonathan and his brothers fall, and Saul, wounded and surrounded, dies by his own hand. Josephus pauses here to praise the courage of a doomed man marching to a death he has been told is certain. Let us finish Book 6.
About this time David heard that the Philistines had made an inroad into the country of Keilah and had robbed it. So he offered to fight against them, if God, when consulted by the prophet, would grant him victory. When the prophet said that God gave a sign of victory, David made a sudden attack on the Philistines with his companions, shed a great deal of their blood, carried off their spoil, and stayed with the inhabitants of Keilah until they had safely gathered in their grain and fruits. However, King Saul was told that David was with the men of Keilah. What David had done, and the great success that had attended him, did not remain only among the people where these things happen. His fame spread everywhere and came to the hearing of others, and both the deed itself and the doer of it were reported to the king. Saul was glad when he heard that David was in Keilah, and he said that God had now put David into his hands, since he had forced him to come into a city with walls, gates, and bars. So Saul commanded all the people to go suddenly, besiege the city, take it, and kill David. But when David perceived this, and learned from God that if he stayed there the men of Keilah would deliver him up to Saul, he took his 400 men, and withdrew into a desert opposite a city called Engedi. When the king heard that David had fled from the men of Keilah, he gave up his expedition against him. Then David left that place, and came to a certain place called the New Place, belonging to Ziph. Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to him there, greeted him, and urged him to be courageous and to hope well for his future condition, and not to despair because of his present circumstances. Jonathan told him that he would be king, and would have all the forces of the Hebrews under him, but that such happiness usually comes with great labor and pain. They also swore oaths that they would continue in goodwill and faithfulness toward one another all their lives. Jonathan called God to witness the curses he had invoked on himself if he should break his covenant and change to the opposite conduct. So Jonathan left David there after making his cares and fears somewhat lighter, and returned home. The men of Ziph, wanting to gratify Saul, informed him that David was staying among them, and assured him that if he came to them, they would deliver David up. They said that if the king seized the straits of Ziph, David would not escape to any other people. The king praised them and admitted that he had reason to thank them, because they had given him information about his enemy. He promised that it would not be long before he repaid their kindness. He also sent men to look for David and search the wilderness where he was, and promised that he himself would follow them. So they went ahead of the king to hunt for and catch David. They tried not only to show their goodwill to Saul by telling him where his enemy was, but to prove it still more plainly by delivering David into his power. But these men failed in their unjust and wicked desires. They faced no danger if they did not reveal David to Saul, yet they falsely accused and promised to deliver up a man beloved by God, a man unjustly sought for death, and one who might otherwise have remained hidden. They did this out of flattery and in expectation of gain from the king. When David learned of the malicious intentions of the men of Ziph and of Saul's approach, he left the straits of that country and fled to the great rock in the wilderness of Maon. Saul then hurried to pursue him there. As he was marching, he learned that David had gone away from the straits of Ziph, and Saul moved to the other side of the rock. But a report that the Philistines had again made an incursion into the country of the Hebrews called Saul away from pursuing David just when David was about to be caught. Saul turned back to oppose those Philistines, who were their natural enemies, judging it more necessary to avenge himself on them than to take great pains to catch his own enemy while overlooking the ravage being made in the land. By this means David unexpectedly escaped the danger he was in and came to the straits of Engedi. When Saul had driven the Philistines out of the land, messengers came and told him that David was staying within the bounds of Engedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen armed men and hurried to him. When he was not far from those places, he saw a deep and hollow cave by the roadside. It was open for a great length and breadth, and David and his 400 men were hidden there. When Saul had occasion to ease himself, he entered the cave by himself. One of David's companions saw him and told David that God, by his providence, had now given him an opportunity to avenge himself on his enemy. He advised David to cut off Saul's head and so free himself from that long wandering condition and the distress he was in. David rose, but only cut off the skirt of the garment Saul was wearing. He soon repented of what he had done and said it was not right to kill the man who was his master, and whom God had thought worthy of the kingdom. Although Saul was wickedly disposed toward them, David said he himself ought not to be so disposed toward Saul. O king, you ought not to listen to wicked men, nor to those who invent slanders, nor gratify them so far as to believe what they say. You ought not to entertain suspicions of those who are your best friends, but to judge the dispositions of all men by their actions. Slander deceives men, but men's own actions clearly show their kindness. Words by nature may be either true or false, but men's actions expose their intentions plainly to our view. Therefore it would be right for you to believe me from these actions concerning my regard for you and your house, and not to believe those who frame accusations against me that never entered my mind and could never be carried out. They do this further by pursuing my life, and have no concern day or night except how to take my life and murder me, which I think you prosecute unjustly. How has it happened that you have embraced this false opinion of me as if I desired to kill you? Or how can you escape the charge of impiety toward God, when you wish to kill and regard as your enemy a man who had it in his power this day to avenge himself and punish you, but would not do it? I would not use such an opportunity, though if it had fallen to you against me, you would not have let it slip. When I cut off the skirt of your garment, I could have done the same to your head. I have certainly abstained from taking a just revenge upon you, yet you are not ashamed to pursue me with unjust hatred. May God do justice and judge between the dispositions of each of us. When Saul left the cave, David came near, cried out loudly, and asked Saul to hear him. The king turned his face back, and David, according to custom, fell on his face before the king and bowed to him. He then spoke and showed Saul the piece of his garment, making him agree that what he said was true. Saul was amazed at the strange deliverance he had received. Deeply moved by the moderation and character of the young man, he groaned. When David did the same, the king answered that David had the most just occasion to groan, because David had been the author of good to Saul, while Saul had been the author of calamity to David. Saul said David had shown that day that he possessed the righteousness of the ancients, who judged that men ought to save their enemies even when they caught them in a deserted place. Saul now believed that God reserved the kingdom for David, and that David would obtain dominion over all the Hebrews. Therefore he asked David to give him assurances by oath that he would not root out Saul's family, nor destroy his posterity out of remembrance of the evil Saul had done him, but would save and preserve his house. David swore as Saul desired and sent Saul back to his own kingdom. David and those with him went up to the straits of Masaroth. About this time Samuel the prophet died. He was a man whom the Hebrews honored in an extraordinary degree. The lamentation the people made for him, and for a long time, showed his virtue in the affection the people bore him. So did the solemnity and concern shown at his funeral, and in the complete observance of all his funeral rites. They buried him in his own city of Ramah, and wept for him a very great number of days, not regarding it as sorrow for the death of another man, but as a sorrow in which every one of them was personally concerned. He was a righteous man and gentle by nature, and for that reason he was very dear to God. He governed and presided over the people alone for 12 years after the death of Eli the high priest, and for 18 years together with Saul the king. Thus the history of Samuel is finished. There was also a Ziphite man from the city of Maon who was rich, and had a vast number of cattle, for he fed a flock of 3,000 sheep and another flock of 1,000 goats. David had ordered his associates to keep these flocks safe and undamaged, and to do them no harm, neither from greed, nor because they were in want, nor because they were in the wilderness and so could not easily be discovered. He instructed them to value freedom from injustice above every other motive, and to regard touching another man's property as a horrible crime contrary to the will of God. He gave these instructions because he thought the favors he granted this man were granted to a good man, one who deserved such care for his affairs. This man's name was Nabal. He was harsh and lived a very wicked life, behaving like a cynic, but he had obtained for his wife a woman of good character, wise and handsome. David sent 10 of his attendants to Nabal at the time when he was shearing his sheep. Through them he greeted him and wished that he might continue doing what he was then doing for many years to come. He asked Nabal to give him whatever present he was able, since Nabal had certainly learned from his shepherds that David's men had done them no injury, but had guarded them for a long time while they remained in the wilderness. David assured him that he would never regret giving anything to David. When the messengers carried this message to Nabal, he addressed them in an inhuman and rough manner. He asked who David was, and when he heard that he was the son of Jesse, he said that this was the time when fugitives grew insolent, made a figure, and left their masters. When the messengers told David this, he was angry. He commanded 400 armed men to follow him, leaving 200 to guard the baggage, for he already had 600, and went against Nabal. He also swore that that night he would utterly destroy the whole house and possessions of Nabal. He was grieved not only because Nabal had proved ungrateful to them, and made no return for the humanity they had shown him, but also because Nabal had reproached them, and used abusive language toward them, though he had received no cause of offense from them. One of those who kept Nabal's flocks told his mistress, Nabal's wife, that when David said to her husband, he had received no civil answer at all. Instead, her husband had added very reproachful language, even though David had taken extraordinary care to keep his flocks from harm. The servant said that what had happened would prove very harmful to his master. When the servant had said this, Abigail, for that was the wife's name, saddled her asses and loaded them with all sorts of presents. Without telling her husband anything about what she was doing, for he was not sensible because of his drunkenness, she went to David. David met her as she was descending a hill, while he was coming against Nabal with 400 men. When the woman saw David, she leaped down from her ass, fell on her face and bowed to the ground. She begged him not to remember the words of Nabal, since he knew that Nabal resembled his name, for Nabal in the Hebrew language means folly. She apologized, saying that she had not seen the messengers he sent. "Forgive me therefore," she said, "and thank God, who has kept you from shedding human blood. As long as you keep yourself innocent, he will avenge you on wicked men. The miseries waiting for Nabal will fall on the heads of your enemies. Be gracious to me and consider me worthy enough to accept these presents from me. Out of regard for me, set aside the wrath and anger you have against my husband and his house, for gentleness and humanity become you, especially since you are to be our king. No, woman, it was nothing other than God's mercy that brought you to us today. Otherwise you would never have seen another day, for I had sworn to destroy Nabal's house this very night, and to leave alive not one of you belonging to a man who was wicked and ungrateful to me and my companions. But now you have prevented me, and have timely softened my anger, being yourself under the care of God's providence. As for Nabal, though for your sake he now escapes punishment, he will not always avoid justice. His evil conduct will be his ruin on some other occasion." After David said this, he dismissed the woman. When she came home, she found her husband feasting with a great company and overcome with wine. She said nothing to him then about what had happened. But the next day, when he was sober, she told him all the particulars, and by her words and the grief arising from them, made his whole body appear like that of a dead man. Nabal survived 10 days, and no more, and then died. When David heard of his death, he said that God had justly avenged him on this man, because Nabal had died by his own wickedness, and had suffered punishment on David's account, while David had kept his own hands clean. At that time David understood that the wicked are pursued by God, and that God overlooks no man, but gives to the good what is suitable to them, and inflicts deserved punishment on the wicked. So David sent to Nabal's wife and invited her to come to him, live with him, and become his wife. She replied to those who came that she was not worthy to touch his feet. Nevertheless, she came with all her servants, and became his wife, receiving that honor because of her wise and righteous way of life. She also obtained the same honor partly because of her beauty. David already had a wife before, whom he had married from the city of XIII. As for Michal, the daughter of King Saul, who had been David's wife, her father had given her in marriage to Phalti, the son of Laish, who was from the city of Galim. After this, certain Ziphites came and told Saul that David had come again into their country, and that if Saul would give them his assistance, they could catch him. So Saul came to them with 3,000 armed men, and at the approach of night he pitched his camp at a certain place called Hachilah. When David heard that Saul was coming against him, he sent spies and ordered them to let him know where in the country Saul had already come. When they told him that Saul was at Hachilah, David concealed his departure from his companions and came to Saul's camp, taking with him Abishai, the son of his sister Zeruiah, and Ahimelech the Hittite. Saul was asleep, and the armed men, with Abner their commander, lay around him in a circle. David entered the king's tent, but he did not kill Saul, though he knew where Saul lay by the spear stuck down beside him. Nor did he allow Abishai to kill him, although Abishai wanted to do so and was very eager for it. David said it was a dreadful crime to kill one who had been ordained king by God, even if he was a wicked man, because the one who had given him the dominion would in time inflict punishment on him. So David restrained Abishai's eagerness. But to show that it had been in his power to kill Saul when he refrained from doing it, David took the spear and the cruse of water that stood beside Saul as he slept. No one in the camp noticed, because they were all asleep, and he went safely away, having done everything among the king's attendants that the opportunity allowed and that his boldness encouraged him to do. After David crossed a brook and climbed to the top of a hill from which he could be clearly heard, he cried aloud to Saul's soldiers and to Abner their commander, waking them from sleep and calling both to him and to the people. The commander heard him and asked who was calling him. David replied, "It is I, the son of Jesse, whom you make a vagabond." "What is the matter? You are a man of such great dignity and of the first rank in the king's court, yet do you take so little care of your master's body? Is sleep more important to you than his preservation, and your care for him? This negligence of yours deserves death and punishment, because you never noticed when, a little while ago, some of us entered your camp, even as far as the king himself and all the rest of you. If you look for the king's spear and his cruse of water, you will learn what a great misfortune was ready to overtake you in your own camp without your knowing it." When Saul recognized David's voice and understood that David had had him in his power while he slept, and that his guards had not taken care of him, yet had not killed him, but spared him when he might justly have cut him off, Saul said that he owed David thanks for his preservation. He urged him to be courageous, not to be afraid of suffering any further harm from him, and to return to his own home. Saul said he was now persuaded that he did not love himself as much as he was loved by David. He said he had driven away the man who could guard him, and had given many demonstrations of goodwill toward him. He had forced David to live so long in banishment, in great fear for his life, and without his friends and kindred, yet Saul had often been saved by him, and had frequently received his life back again when it was clearly in danger of perishing. So David told them to send for the spear and the cruse of water and take them back. He added that God would judge both their dispositions and the actions that flowed from them, and that God knew it had been in David's power that day to kill Saul, but he had abstained from doing so. Thus Saul, having escaped David's hands twice, went on his way to his royal palace in his own city. But David was afraid that if he stayed there he would be caught by Saul, so he thought it better to go up into the land of the Philistines and stay there. Accordingly he came with the 600 men who were with him to Achish, the king of Gath, which was one of their 5 cities. The king received both David and his men and gave them a place to live. David also had with him his 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, and he lived in Gath. When Saul heard this, he took no further care to send for him or go after him, because in a manner he had twice been caught by David while trying to catch him. However, David did not wish to continue in the city of Gath. He asked the king, since he had received him with such humanity, to grant him another favor and bestow on him some place in that country for his habitation, because he was ashamed to be troublesome and burdensome to him by living in the city. So Achish gave him a certain village called Ziklag. David and his sons were fond of this place when he was king and regarded it as their own special inheritance, but those matters will be explained further elsewhere. The time David lived in Ziklag, in the land of the Philistines, was 4 months and 20 days. He privately attacked the Geshurites and Amalekites, who were neighbors of the Philistines, laid waste their country, took much spoil of their beasts and camels, and then returned home. But David spared the men, fearing they might reveal him to King Achish. Yet he sent part of the spoil to Achish as a free gift. When the king asked whom they had attacked when they brought away the spoil, David said it was those who lay to the south of the Jews and lived in the plain. By this he persuaded Achish to approve of what he had done, for Achish hoped that David had fought against his own nation, and that now he would have David as his servant for his whole life, and that David would remain in his country. About the same time, the Philistines resolved to make war against the Israelites. They sent word to all their allies that they should go with them to the war at Regan, near the city Shunem, where they might gather together and suddenly attack the Hebrews. Then Achish, the king of Gath, asked David to assist them with his armed men against the Hebrews. David readily promised to do so and said that the time had now come when he could repay Achish for his kindness and hospitality. So the king promised to make David the keeper of his body after the victory, assuming that the battle with the enemy succeeded as they wished. He made this promise of honor and confidence on purpose to increase David's zeal for his service. Saul, the king of the Hebrews, had driven out of the country the fortune-tellers, the necromancers, and all those who practiced similar arts, except for the prophets. But when he heard that the Philistines had already come and had pitched their camp near the city Shunem, which lay in the plain, he hurried to oppose them with his forces. When he came to a certain mountain called Gilboa, he pitched his camp opposite the enemy. But when he saw the enemy's army, he was greatly troubled, because it seemed to him numerous and superior to his own. He inquired of God by the prophets concerning the battle, so that he might know beforehand what its outcome would be. When God did not answer him, Saul fell into still greater fear, and his courage sank. He foresaw, as was reasonable to suppose, that mischief would befall him now that God was not there to help him. Saul ordered his servants to find him some woman who was a necromancer and called up the souls of the dead, so that he might know whether his affairs would turn out as he wished. Such necromantic women bring up the souls of the dead and through them foretell future events to those who desire it. One of his servants told him that there was such a woman in the city Endor, but that she was known to no one in the camp. So Saul took off his royal clothing, took with him 2 of his servants whom he knew to be most faithful to him, and came to the woman at Endor. He begged her to act as a fortune-teller and to bring up for him whatever soul he should name to her. But the woman opposed his request. She said that she did not despise the king, who had banished this kind of fortune-teller, and that he himself was not acting well, since she had done him no harm, by trying to lay a snare for her and expose her practice of a forbidden art in order to have her punished. Saul swore that no one would know what she did, that he would not tell anyone else what she foretold, and that she would be in no danger. As soon as he had persuaded her by this oath to fear no harm, he told her to bring up for him the soul of Samuel. The woman, not knowing who Samuel was, called him out of Hades. When he appeared and the woman saw someone venerable and divine in form, she was disturbed and astonished at the sight. She asked whether he was not King Saul, for Samuel had informed her who he was. When Saul admitted that this was true and asked why she was disturbed, she said that she saw a certain person ascending whose form was like a god. Saul asked her to tell him what he looked like, what clothing he appeared in, and what age he was. She told him that he was already an old man of glorious appearance, and that he wore a sacerdotal mantle. By these signs the king recognized that it was Samuel. He fell down on the ground, greeted him, and worshipped him. When the soul of Samuel asked Saul why he had disturbed him and caused him to be brought up, Saul lamented the necessity he was under. He said that his enemies pressed heavily upon him, that he was distressed about what to do in his present circumstances, that he was forsaken by God, and that he could obtain no prediction of what was coming, either by prophets or by dreams. He said these were the reasons why he had resorted to Samuel, who had always taken great care of him. It is in vain for you to desire to learn anything future from me when God has forsaken you. However, hear what I say. David is to be king and is to finish this war with good success. You are to lose your dominion and your life, because you did not obey God in the war with the Amalekites, and did not keep his commandments as I foretold you while I was alive. Know therefore that the people shall be made subject to their enemies, and that you with your sons shall fall in battle tomorrow, and then you shall be with me in Hades. When Saul heard this, he could not speak because of grief, and he fell down on the floor. Whether this was from the sorrow that arose from what Samuel had said, or from his emptiness. Since he had taken no food the previous day or night, he easily fell completely down. When he had recovered himself with difficulty, the woman tried to force him to eat. She begged this favor of him because of her concern in that dangerous act of fortune-telling, which it had not been lawful for her to perform. Because of the fear she had of the king, although she did not know who he was, she had nevertheless undertaken it and carried it through. For this reason she begged him to allow a table and food to be set before him, so that he might regain his strength and get safely back to his own camp. When he opposed her proposal and wholly rejected it because of his anxiety, she pressed him and at last persuaded him. She had one calf of which she was very fond, one she took great care of and fed herself. She was a woman who got her living by the labor of her own hands, and she had no other possession but that one calf. She killed it, prepared its meat, and set it before Saul and his servants. Saul returned to the camp while it was still night. It is only just to commend the generosity of this woman. The king had forbidden her to use the art by which her circumstances were improved, and she had never seen the king before. Yet she did not remember against him that he had condemned her kind of knowledge, nor did she refuse him as a stranger and one with whom she had no acquaintance. Instead, she had compassion on him, comforted him, urged him to do what he was strongly unwilling to do, and earnestly offered him, with great humanity, the only creature she had, though she was a poor woman. She received no repayment for her kindness, and did not seek any future favor from him, for she knew he was going to die. Men are naturally either eager to please those who bestow benefits on them, or very ready to serve those from whom they may receive some advantage. Therefore, it would be good to imitate her example, to do kindnesses to all who are in need, and to think that nothing is better or more becoming to mankind than such general generosity, nor anything that will more quickly make God favorable and ready to bestow good things on us. Let this be enough concerning this woman. But I shall speak further on another subject, which will give me an opportunity to discuss what is advantageous for cities, peoples, and nations, and suited to the taste of good men. It will encourage them all in the pursuit of virtue, show them the desirability of acquiring glory and everlasting fame, impress on the kings of nations and rulers of cities a great inclination and diligence in doing well, encourage them to undergo dangers and die for their countries, and instruct them how to despise the most terrible adversities. Saul, the king of the Hebrews, gives me a fitting occasion to enter on such a discourse. Although he knew by the prophet's prediction what was coming upon him, and that he was about to die immediately, he did not resolve to flee from death. Nor did he indulge the love of life, so far as to betray his own people to the enemy or bring disgrace on his royal dignity. Instead, exposing himself, together with all his family and children, to danger, he thought it a brave thing to fall together with them while fighting for his subjects. He judged it better that his sons should die in this way, showing their courage, than to leave them to an uncertain life afterward. In place of succession and posterity, they gained praise and a lasting name. Such a man alone seems to me to be just, courageous, and prudent. When anyone has reached these dispositions, or shall hereafter reach them, he is the man who ought to be honored by all with the testimony of being virtuous or courageous. As for those who go out to war with hopes of success and of returning safely, even if they have performed some glorious action, I think those do not do well who call them valiant men, as many historians and other writers who treat of them are accustomed to do, though I admit they also justly deserve some praise. Only those may truly be called courageous and bold in great undertakings, and despisers of adversities, who imitate Saul. Those who do not know what the outcome of war will be for themselves, and who, though they do not grow faint in it, give themselves over to uncertain futurity and are tossed this way and that, do not show such an eminent example of a generous mind, even if they happen to perform many great deeds. But when men's minds expect no good outcome, when they know beforehand that they must die and that they must undergo the death in battle, and after this are neither frightened nor astonished at the terrible fate coming upon them, but go straight toward it, though they know it beforehand, this is what I consider the mark of a truly courageous man. Saul did this, and thereby demonstrated that all men who desire fame after death must act in this way if they would obtain it. This especially concerns kings, who ought not to think it enough in their high stations merely not to be wicked in governing their subjects, but should be more than moderately good to them. I could say more than this about Saul and his courage, since the subject gives sufficient material, but so that I may not seem to run on improperly in praising him, I return again to the history from which I made this digression. When the Philistines, as I said before, had pitched their camp and counted their forces according to their nations, kingdoms, and governments, King Achish came last of all with his own army. After him came David with his 600 armed men. When the commanders of the Philistines saw him, they asked the king where these Hebrews had come from and at whose invitation. Achish answered that this was David, who had fled from his master Saul, that he had received him when David came to him, and that now David was willing to repay him for his favors and avenge himself on Saul, and so had become his ally. The commanders complained that Achish had taken as an ally a man who was an enemy. They advised him to send David away, lest by receiving him he unknowingly do his friends great harm, because he was giving David an opportunity to be reconciled to his master by harming their army. Therefore, with prudent foresight, they asked Achish to send David away with his 600 armed men to the place he had given him to live. They said this was the David whom the virgins celebrated in their songs as having destroyed many tens of thousands of the Philistines. When the king of Gath heard this, he thought they spoke well. So he called David and told him that, as for himself, he could bear witness that David had shown great diligence and kindness toward him, and that for this reason he had taken him as his ally. Nevertheless, what he had done did not please the commanders of the Philistines. Therefore David should go within a day's time to the place that Achish had given him, without suspecting any harm, and there guard Achish's country, lest any of their enemies make an incursion upon it. This would be one part of the assistance Achish expected from him. So David came to Ziklag, as the king of Gath ordered him. But it happened that while he had gone to assist the Philistines, the Amalekites had already made an incursion, taken Ziklag, and burned it. After they had taken a great deal of other spoil from that place, and from other parts of the Philistines' country, they departed. When David found that Ziklag had been laid waste and completely spoiled, and that his own 2 wives, as well as the wives of his companions and their children, had been taken captive, he immediately tore his clothes, weeping and lamenting together with his friends. He was so crushed by these misfortunes that at last his tears themselves failed him. He was also in danger of being stoned to death by his companions, who were greatly distressed over the captivity of their wives and children, for they blamed him for what had happened. But when David recovered himself from his grief and lifted up his mind to God, he asked the high priest Abiathar to put on his sacerdotal garments and inquire of God, and to prophesy to him whether God would grant that, if he pursued the Amalekites, he would overtake them, save their wives and children, and avenge himself on the enemies. When the high priest told him to pursue them, David marched quickly after the enemy with his 400 men. When David came to a certain brook called Besor, he came upon a man wandering about, an Egyptian by birth, who was almost dead from want and famine, for he had gone without food while wandering in the wilderness for 3 days. David first gave him sustenance, both food and drink, and refreshed him. Then he asked whom he belonged to and where he came from. The man told him that he was an Egyptian by birth, and had been left behind by his master, because he was so sick and weak that he could not follow him. He also told David that he had been one of those who had burned and plundered not only other parts of Judea, but Ziklag itself as well. So David used him as a guide to find the Amalekites. When he overtook them, they were lying scattered on the ground, some at dinner, some disorderly, and all completely drunk with wine and enjoying their spoil and prey. David fell on them suddenly and made a great slaughter among them. They were unarmed and expected no such thing, but had given themselves over to drinking and feasting, so they were all easily destroyed. Some were overtaken and killed as they lay at the table, their blood mingling with their food and drink. Others were killed as they drank to one another from their cups, and some when their full bellies had made them fall asleep. As many as had time to put on their armor were killed with the sword as easily as those who were naked. David's men continued the slaughter from the first hour of the day until evening, so that no more than 400 of the Amalekites were left, and those escaped only by getting on their dromedaries and camels. David recovered not only all the other spoil that the enemy had carried away, but also his wives and the wives of his companions. When they came to the place where they had left the 200 men who had been unable to follow them, but had remained to guard the baggage, the 400 men did not think it right to divide any other part of what they had gotten, or of the spoil among them, because they had not accompanied them. They claimed those men had pretended to be weak, and had not followed in pursuit of the enemy, and said they should be content with having safely recovered their wives. But David declared that this opinion was evil and unjust. Since God had granted them such a favor, enabling them to avenge themselves on their enemies and recover all that belonged to them, they should distribute equally what they had obtained to all, because the others had stayed behind to guard their baggage. From that time this law took effect among them. Those who guarded the baggage should receive an equal share with those who fought in battle. When David came to Ziklag, he sent portions of the spoil to all who had been familiar with him, and to his friends in the tribe of Judah. Thus ended the affairs of the plundering of Ziklag, and the slaughter of the Amalekites. When the Philistines joined battle with the Hebrews, a sharp engagement followed. The Philistines became the conquerors and killed a great number of their enemies. But Saul, the king of Israel, and his sons fought courageously and with the greatest eagerness, knowing that their whole glory lay in nothing but dying honorably and exposing themselves to the utmost danger from the enemy, for they had nothing else to hope for. So they drew the whole power of the enemy upon themselves until they were surrounded and killed, but not before they had killed many of the Philistines. The sons of Saul were Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. When these were killed, the multitude of the Hebrews was put to flight, and everything became disorder, confusion, and slaughter as the Philistines pressed in upon them. Saul himself fled with a strong body of soldiers around him. When the Philistines sent after them men who threw javelins and shot arrows, he lost all his company except a few. As for Saul, he fought with great bravery. When he had received so many wounds that he could no longer stand or resist, and yet could not kill himself, he ordered his armor-bearer to draw his sword and run him through before the enemy could take him alive. But his armor-bearer did not dare kill his master. So Saul drew his own sword, placed himself against its point, and threw himself on it. When he could neither run it through himself nor make the sword pass through him by leaning against it, he turned around and asked a certain young man standing by who he was. When he learned that he was an Amalekite, Saul asked him to force the sword through him, because he was not able to do it with his own hands, and so procure for him the death he desired. The young man did this. Then he took the golden bracelet that was on Saul's arm and the royal crown that was on his head, and ran away. When Saul's armor-bearer saw that Saul was killed, he killed himself. None of the king's guards escaped. They all fell on the mountain called Gilboa. When the Hebrews who lived in the valley beyond Jordan, and those who had their cities in the plain, heard that Saul and his sons had fallen, and that the multitude around them had been destroyed, they left their own cities and fled to those that were best fortified and fenced. The Philistines found those cities deserted and came to live in them. On the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain enemies, they found the bodies of Saul and his sons. They stripped them, cut off their heads, and sent messengers throughout their country to announce that their enemies had fallen. They dedicated their armor in the temple of Astarte, but hung their bodies on crosses at the walls of the city Bethshan, which is now called Scythopolis. When the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard that the dead bodies of Saul and his sons had been dismembered, they considered it too horrible to overlook this barbarity and allow them to remain without funeral rites. The most courageous and hardy among them, for that city contained men very strong both in body and mind, traveled all night and came to Bethshan. They approached the enemy's wall, took down the bodies of Saul and his sons, and carried them to Jabesh, while the enemy were neither able nor bold enough to hinder them because of their great courage. All the people of Jabesh wept together and buried their bodies in the best place of their country, which was named Erewin. They observed public mourning for them for 7 days, with their wives and children beating their breasts and lamenting the king and his sons, without tasting food or drink until evening. This was the end Saul came to, according to the prophecy of Samuel, because he disobeyed God's commands concerning the Amalekites, and also because he destroyed the family of Ahimelech the high priest, together with Ahimelech himself and the city of the high priests. Saul ended his life in this manner after he had reigned 18 years while Samuel was alive, and after Samuel's death 22 years.
And their book 6 ends, on the slopes of Gilboa Saul and Jonathan dead, the army broken, the first king of Israel fallen after a reign that began in such promise and ended in jealousy, disobedience and despair. Josephus gives him a soldier's salute at the last, and so will we. The throne now stands empty, and the man the women once sang of waits in the wilderness, anointed but uncrowned. The reign of David, the wars, the glory, and the great sin is where book 7 begins. Thank you for sitting with the whole of book 6, from the return of the ark to the grave of Saul. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.